Atomic Heart is a game that took me on a bit of a roller coaster. At first it raised my expectations, and I was looking forward to seeing what it might offer. But then it disappointed me and made itself feel cheap and unengaging. But later on, it started to show more of itself, and that brought my opinion back up to a more even keel, although that took some time. And if you look at the initial reviews of the game, I don't seem to be the only one who's experienced something like this. It's a mixed lot, and from my own experience I'd say that, at least partly, it comes down to how far into the game people got before they wrote those opinions. Because it's a slow burn of a game, and one way to describe it would be as unfamiliar. Yet, at the same time, too familiar. There's a paradox at the heart of this game. So I'd like to explore some of the reasons why I'm saying that, and hopefully give people a better idea of what this game is trying to accomplish, what it does well, and what it doesn't do so well. Many thanks go to Monthfish for being generous enough to provide this review key. But of course, this video is not sponsored, so all opinions are entirely my own. I'm basing my comments on a fully completed run of the game, and all side areas explored. I've also completed the latest DLC, Enchantment Under the Sea, and I'll talk about it separately at the end. But I have not yet done the first two DLCs, which do seem to extend the narrative past the end of the main game. Overall, I've spent just over 69 hours, nice of course, before putting my thoughts down, and I think that I can give you a balanced perspective of what Atomic Heart actually is like.
Have an exceptionally brilliant and
The game starts you off in an idyllic floating city. It's the 1950s, and this version of the Soviet Union is in its triumphant heyday. Everybody's happy, and flying drones are ready to serve you free drinks. So, a proper communist utopia, right? I wouldn't blame you for thinking that this is almost straight out of Bioshock Infinite. Just instead of the US being a utopia, we're looking at one that's been painted over with a communist red coat and the hammer and sickle. And this Bioshock influence is made very clear when you overhear a conversation where the code is 0451.
Give me your control code. I'll set him straight. Hold Piggy, sweetie.
Oh, thanks, Mum. The code's 0451.
This is a well-known code that goes all the way back to System Shock, and every game that draws from that lineage references that Easter egg in some way. The developers seem to be immersive sim fans, and as someone who's very interested in player choice, I'm always willing to spend time on anything that pays homage to those games. Visually, the game is very good looking, both in this section and throughout the game. Although there are a couple of noticeable issues. The first is that faces tend to be quite similar to each other. This makes more sense once the game proper starts, and you realize that aside from the main characters, you're only ever going to see NPCs as corpses. So whether they look the same is not that important, and this probably allowed the devs to save quite a lot of effort, so I'd give this a pass. But the second is that the subtitles when they speak are so small as to be basically unreadable. And unfortunately you can't change the size through the game settings. The UI size options do affect everything else, like direct dialogue, but the subtitles seem to have been overlooked. Aside from those little technical issues, the game presents itself very well. As you go through this introductory area, you'll also get a bit of world building if you look for it, which is another aspect that takes a bit of time to get used to. In this timeline, the Soviet Union's taken its place in the sun as one of the leading countries in the world. The key to this was the discovery in 1936 of polymers by the genius Sechenov, who just happens to be your boss. That then led to the discovery of hydrogen fuel cells, which in turn led to robots being widely available, thereby freeing up Soviet citizens first, then the rest of the world's citizens from menial jobs. And now the Soviet Union is about to take the next leap forward with neuropolymers that will allow people to control robots and communicate with each other via just their thoughts. All this success is founded on the Soviet victory during World War II. Although in this alternate timeline, instead of V2 rockets, The Nazis invented what's known as the Brown Plague, a pandemic that devastated most of the world and thus allowed the Soviet Union to take its place in the sun. That's as opposed to real history, where the Soviet Union took most of the casualties of World War II, and subsequently was always playing catch up with the US. This foundation gets built on if you take the time to read the terminals you find throughout the game, but the gist of it is that the Soviet Union is on the cutting edge of technological advancement. It's donating robots to less advanced countries like the US and Europe in the name of world peace. There is a darker side to this, but it mostly forms a backdrop to the game aside from the odd occasion it does get mentioned. But this monument, and the introduction as a whole, does highlight one of the issues in the immersion. I don't read Cyrillic, so that makes all the slogans and most of the writing difficult to take in. Things like this monument and a lot of signs do have subtitles when you mouse over them, but you do have to go out of your way to do that. And because most of the writing is mundane, you end up not bothering after a while. I'm sure that things like the graffiti on the wall make sense to someone who can read them, but that's not me. I agree that it's a small thing and basically unavoidable when you set a game in a non-English speaking location. But overall, someone who's not from that culture will find it that slight bit more difficult to immerse themselves in this world. Then there's the seemingly unabashed praise for the Soviet Union, which is another alien aspect. I'm sure that those who grew up in the old Soviet Union or the old Warsaw Pact nations could immediately recognize the inherent parody of the world was shown at the start of the game. But not coming from that background, I found myself not able to recognize which parts were the smoke and mirrors that every society uses to fool its citizens, to at least some degree, and which parts were meant to be taken seriously. As a result, it felt like a cartoon version of a world. Too clean, too tidy. To be fair though, you do get small indications that not all is as it appears.
Everyone here seems so happy and content. Just like in China.
You've been to China, Comrade Major?
I've been everywhere. I mean, everywhere except for China, I guess.
Facility 3820.
Even during the introduction, which is good, but it does take a fair while for them to build up.
I hear it's nice there.
This initial setup deeply reminded me of the lore in the Bioshock games, where the world claims to be pristine and perfect, but that was shown to be an illusion. In many ways, Atomic Heart's initial setup resembles Bioshock Infinite the most, especially when it comes to having a unique visual signature. There's a lot of dark areas at the start, but a particular highlight is the use of lighting when it's there. It's tastefully used to accentuate the architecture. Aside from the office furniture maybe being reused too often, every area you go through has a distinct look and feel that's based on its purpose. So hydroponics looks like what I imagine a hydroponics section to look like. Lots of artificial lighting to help the plants grow. And of course, lots of organic enemies. The seed bank looks like a mass storage area with tall stacks of containers and utility robots all around. There's an obvious level of care and thought that's gone into the architecture and visual design of every area. This unique look applies particularly well to the robots you end up fighting. You can see that there was a lot of inspiration taken from their purpose. So logging robots are tough and have a prominent sword that they use in combat. Grain harvesting robots have a myriad of sides that they use to slice you up. Humanoid robots have that crash test dummy look. And the police humanoids have a color scheme distinct from the other humanoid robots. I'm particularly fond of the use of the Archimedes screw type fans on the flying robots. It gives them a unique look while still fulfilling their function. Although I found myself asking why this type of robot needs to have a tube going to its head. That's obviously an artistic choice to humanize it by giving it something resembling a mouth. You can also see Eastern European influences in the art style, like the way the hair is done on these robots, which I understand is traditionally Slavic. The overall look and feel of the game, including the music, is unmistakably Russian. Show anyone an image from Bioshock Infinite and they would instantly recognize it. The same goes for Atomic Heart's environments and robots. which speaks well for the design. Personally, I think the visual aspects are a real strength of the game.
Yeah, been there, done that. Skip the foreplay, bot.
So while my initial hopes were raised by the visuals and the potential in the introduction, the early stages of the game also dashed them somewhat. The first issue you run across is yourself. Not you the player, but the protagonist you play as.
Shut your trap and keep scanning, would you? I'm getting acquainted with the new hardware.
He's best described as an over-aggressive asshole.
Anyway, why the hell are we riding a jalopy strapped to a damn robot? Were all the jets taken or something? Shit.
In for both of us.
Shut the hell up, Glove. I'm trying to listen.
To what?
Most of the dialogue you'll see is between you and your Glove. And let's just say that it's usually a lot of venting and anger, but without any purpose that might make it worth listening to. Of course, that's a subjective opinion, and I'm sure that there's people out there that would find it likable. But I'm also pretty sure that they'd fall into an audience that wouldn't really appreciate immersive sim type games. And it doesn't help that one of the opening cutscenes involves a badass granny shooting down robots.
2 days now. Take that. Eat shit and die.
And the vendor bot talking dirty just felt like pointless smut.
How titillating! Rebellious dominant men really turn me on.
Oh, I'll turn you on, all right. Just let me at you.
What a brute! Oh, I love tough guys. I'm on fire.
Closer! I can't reach
It all felt like an edgy teenager's impression of what a quote-unquote cool game looks like.
Sugar?
The main character is so cool that even stupid sexy robots are begging to be penetrated.
Honey, you're back. What took you so long? I was so lonely.
Just give me laser protection.
Oh, so brutal. I'm shaking. Squirt your polymer inside me.
Yes, I feel like such a badass hero. It seems so cheesy, and it felt like the game offered you nothing but combat in a cartoonish world, with you playing the part of a one-dimensional C-grade action hero. Something more like Duke Nukem than the Fallout and Bioshock it claims to be inspired by. You just get a sense that the game is being pulled in multiple directions rather than having a coherent direction. This is reinforced by the fact that the NPCs, other than a few characters in the plot, are just dead corpses, with the same faces we saw during the introduction. I spoke to every corpse I came across, but too much of it was just flavor text. Some of it is pretty well written and acted, but ultimately, you know it serves no actual purpose in the game because it's literally from the mouth of a corpse. From my gameplay perspective, the indoor spaces that the early game takes place in tend to be pretty linear. You have your large locations where most of the gameplay takes place in, but the interlinking spaces will tend to be linear corridors. Some double back, but those mostly exist as shortcuts back to the starting area in a way that resembles the shortcuts in Skyrim dungeons. There will be side rooms to explore, but any side areas will mostly be dead ends with a bit of loot as a reward. So the scope for actual exploration is quite small. The goal is mostly about searching for loot. Unfortunately, this lack of exploration is exacerbated by the scan power. It's an unlimited power that you can use at any time and highlights loot and enemies. The effect that this has on gameplay is that looking around rooms is kind of meaningless, because you can always scan for loot, so there's no joy of discovery like there is in games like The Long Dark. And you can also never be surprised by enemies, because you can see them through walls by scanning. So exploration mostly consisted of running through linear corridors towards rooms, quickly scanning them to see if there's anything worth looting or fighting, hoovering up any loot, and running to the next location. The game systems were combining to train me, as a player, to disregard the world and the environment, which was made worse because there's some dark areas where you have to use the scanner to see anything. The game is built around the assumption that you'll be relying on the scanner. I actually had to restrain myself from using it as I played, because I felt I was disrespecting the graphical artists who worked on the game, by not even bothering to see the details in the rooms and corridors. All of this put together made the game world seem cheap. Not in terms of cost, but in terms of gameplay value. If the people who put the game together didn't want me to bother with the world, then it must not be worth my attention. There's a disconnect happening between what the gameplay is encouraging you to do and the effort that went into the world building. I found myself just skimming through the dialogue, and that's never a good sign, especially because I'm the type to listen to every conversation and read every lore dump in a game. I felt that the world simply existed because it had to exist, not because it had a purpose. The environment was just something to run past to get to the next encounter, which is a pretty sad thing to say because obvious effort was put into the look and feel, and it is worth taking the time to look around. More focus is given to the major encounters in the game and the associated cutscenes, particularly as you get further into the game. It's best not to spoil them because they do affect the experience, but here's a small snippet that should give you a taste. Some of them are a bit artistically esoteric, so it may take a bit of time getting used to, but you can see that there was a specific art direction involved. From a gameplay perspective, you can argue that the Bioshocks aren't that different from Atomic Heart. You do play a part in the plot, but ultimately you're an observer in someone else's story, and the only way to engage with the world is via combat. In the first Bioshock, this is cleverly explained away by the "would you kindly" line. Of course you had no choice. All this was pre-programmed into you well before the game started. But that doesn't change the fact that it's a linear game mostly about combat. This is not any different in Atomic Heart. It's also a linear game mostly about combat. Personally, I felt that the gameplay was fine if you look at it by itself. My concerns are the same as I had with Bioshock. So that comment is not even about Atomic Heart per se, more of a personal preference. So if you do happen to like Bioshock's gameplay, you can take that as a vote of confidence for Atomic Heart, because it most definitely took close inspiration from Bioshock in that regard. You start with an axe, and soon enough a shotgun. Then the game teaches you to use the shock power, which you can use to open some doors and stun robots in combat. If you have played Bioshock or Prey, then this will feel very familiar. Although one key difference is that you get a dodge, which you can upgrade to give you invulnerability frames, just like in Souls type games. Unfortunately, dodge doesn't work well without upgrades, especially the ability to double dodge, because the distance on a single dodge is pretty small, so physically getting out of the way of attacks can be difficult at times. I found it better to use dodge as a way to maintain distance from melee enemies, at least early on. And a bit of a gotcha is that you can get surrounded and killed by enemies in the indoor sections, so that's something to watch out for in the early game. You mostly fight robots, which can loot for components to upgrade your weapons, and polymer to upgrade your own abilities and powers. Each robot type fights in a unique way and has particular weaknesses that you can take advantage of, so there will be variety to the combat. There are some biological enemies in the form of nests that swarm flying critters. They can attack you directly, or they can latch onto a corpse, which will animate, and it's much harder to kill them. So the incentive is to kill the nests as soon as possible to stop the spawns in the first place, otherwise you run the risk of getting swarmed. There's a distinct lack of variety to these enemies, so my impression was that they may have been added later on in development. But they are there, and they do provide polymer and upgrade resources. Usually an area will have either bio or robot enemies, and if you happen to see them together, they'll actually fight each other, which is always a nice touch to see. Every weapon is upgradable in a variety of ways, and this is a strength of the game. So your shotgun can have its barrel, stock, and magazines upgraded with plans you can learn by exploring. Plus you can also add elemental damage via special cartridges to further boost your effectiveness against certain enemies. Each upgrade is quite distinct, and they change the way the weapons work, So we're not just looking at increasing damage values, you're changing the behavior of these weapons. So with the shotgun you can change the spread pattern, and this has its pros and cons. Your resources get refunded if you change mods, so the game is clearly trying to encourage you to play around with them. Weapons also break down into two classes. One uses ammo like traditional weapons, and the other is energy based and draws on your built-in battery that slowly recharges itself. I'm used to playing games where ammo is scarce, so I personally gravitate towards those energy weapons that give you unlimited ammo. For example, the scrappy energy pistol you get at the beginning carried me through most of the game. You can take that as evidence that the upgrades do change the way the game plays, and all weapons are effective even into the end game. On the other hand, I found the sniper type rail rifle one of the least useful weapons, because it just didn't snipe as well as it should, and a fair amount of the game is spent in indoor spaces, where opportunities to snipe are much rarer. So ironically, I used it the most when fighting bosses you run across in the mid-game, because those fights are usually about running for your life and getting the occasional shot off in between, so the extra damage per shot was good to have. I think the game plays best at close or medium ranges. That's when it's most fun. Ammunition also takes up inventory space, so I found that it was better to stash my ammo for the boss fights and use energy weapons while exploring, although there is also the option of crafting ammo if you choose a different style. Any item can be stashed instantly, and these stashes have unlimited storage, but retrieving them requires access to a vendor. Luckily you run across them quite often, so you never feel a scarcity of resources, and there's always one just before a boss fight. So while there is a limited inventory, in practice the biggest issue you run into is losing items because you forgot to free up inventory before looting corpses. There's a good variety of weapons for different playstyles, but I played most of the game with several energy weapons, and the shotgun or another traditional gun, then adding something like the AK for extra DPS when fighting bosses. Another similarity with the Bioshocks is that melee never goes out of style if you upgrade your weapons and abilities. A unique feature of Atomic Heart is that you don't have mana. The only restriction on the use of powers is a cooldown, and even that gets reduced by upgrading the powers. The game most definitely wants you to make use of them as often as you can. And you should, because they're pretty damn useful. Aside from the electric shock power that everybody gets, you also get a freeze power. This power allows you to freeze enemies so you can focus on the rest of the group. But if you upgrade it, it also gives you extra rewards when you shatter those enemies. You can use it against bosses too, but you have to be perfect to actually freeze them before it runs out, so it's not as good against them. I only managed it once and it wasn't that useful. You should save it for normal enemies. For bosses, Polymer Jet works better. It behaves very similarly to the Goo Gun from Prey, although you can't use it for things like climbing, and its primary purpose is to enhance elemental damage. So you can use it to spray enemies and then shock them for extra damage. With a few upgrades, it also slows them down, so both effects are very useful against a boss. But you can also use it for area denial against lesser enemies by creating a line of goo on the ground, then electrify it so enemies crossing it get shocked. I only briefly tried mass telekinesis, but it works by levitating enemies in an area, then slamming them into the ground to cause damage. It's useful for group control when you have a lot of enemies ganging up on you, but by the time I tried it properly, I had good enough gear that I was mowing down enemy groups pretty quickly anyway. The most important power in my opinion is the shield. At first it reduces the damage you take, but as you upgrade it, it makes you invulnerable, heals you, and recharges your battery as it gets hit. It was perfectly viable to activate your shield and wail on the enemy with a big ass mace, just like a medieval fighting game. An upgraded shield power changes how you play the game. The bonus is that melee attacks also recharge your battery. So once you've upgraded yourself a bit, you can cycle between shooting your expensive energy weapons, then swap to melee to recharge them while protecting yourself with your shield, and then swapping back to energy weapons while your shield power is on cooldown. Repeat that cycle and pretty much any enemy will go down. I played the game on medium difficulty, and the first fight against this type of boss was basically me running around like a headless chicken and taking the occasional potshot with my crappy energy pistol. Then back to doing a chicken run while waiting for my battery to regenerate. It took forever to beat this guy, and frankly I was frustrated by the fight. Because as I later found out, you're supposed to melee them, but that would have been a disaster for me at this stage. But later on I was beating this guy like he was a red-headed stepchild with my big ass mace. It was immensely satisfying to say the least. I know that some people might not like powerful enemies becoming easier with upgrades, but I lean the other way. You most definitely feel rewarded for taking the time to find weapon upgrades and the resources to upgrade your powers. Those who want harder combat can always play at higher difficulties. One downside of the combat system is that it does assume that you'll be relying on invulnerability frames from dodging and the shield power, because it's very easy to lose track of bosses during fights, and some bosses will just have cheese type abilities that you can't physically dodge, and getting hit means that you can easily end up stun locked to death. Some of those bosses will at times also pull off insta-kill moves that you need to QTE your way through. I personally hate QTE sequences, so if you're like me, the game does have a lot of accessibility options to disable certain gameplay elements, which is not always common in games, and the designers should be commended for including them in Atomic Heart. You probably got the hint by now that Atomic Heart drew heavy inspiration from Bioshock, particularly Bioshock Infinite. But a key difference between the two games is that in Infinite, you're immediately shown what's behind the initial illusion, and you end up playing a pivotal role in addressing it. In contrast, Atomic Heart takes a fair while before it starts to let its mask slip. If I was to summarize the plot of the game without spoilers, it boils down to your choice of who is going to rule this version of the Soviet Union. The game presents you evidence of what's been happening as you play it, and ultimately your final choice is based on the player interpreting those individual fragments. So there is that, but if we talk about the world and the lore, it may as well not exist for all the relevance it has on the plot. This is a key weakness in my opinion. If a game wants to succeed in creating a new franchise, the lore and the world building of a game must engage the player. This is what the first Fallout did ever so well. It was never just about the water chip. It created a world that not only provided a backdrop for the plot of the game, but the lore of the world also affected and explained the motivations of the characters the player engages with. There was value in knowing the world, so players became familiar with it. That allowed the franchise to be a franchise with multiple successful games and a very loyal fanbase. It's the lore. In contrast, Atomic Heart's world building provides a backdrop, but it doesn't affect the game at all. You could set it in an entirely different lore and the plot would work exactly the same way. This is a subjective opinion, and to some people it may be like porn in that the plot doesn't really matter, but for me this was a frustration with the game. It's not every day that you see a game set in a fictional Soviet Union. That alone makes it innovative. You've got your metros and your stalkers, and precious little else. The unfamiliarity of a new lore is a bit alien at first, but as you engage with it, that can actually give a world a refreshing flavor that actually leads to more interest than if the world was familiar. But there has to be something for the player to latch onto. I don't know anything about Polish mythology, and I'm pretty sure that neither do you. But despite that, the Witcher series is phenomenally successful, and you can take the success of the Netflix series as a good indication that people engage with the lore itself, not just the games. But the hook was Geralt and his friends. That's what engaged players initially. Atomic Heart presented me with a lore for a new universe, and in many ways the lore could be seen as fresh and worth engaging with, but it didn't allow me to do that. Was the character likable? No, they were eminently dislikable. Or at least that was the initial impression. Was there a mystery to the world? No, the Soviet Union is the best, and that's that. There's no equivalent to the ruins of Rapture that draws the player into Bioshock. It's fine as a backdrop, but it's not something you can expect people to invest in without some form of engagement. I'm sure that some people will point out that Metro and Stalker also limit their world building to backdrops. And this is true, but at the same time, these are somewhat familiar backdrops that you don't really have to engage with to understand. The world has gone to crap and you must survive in it. That's a good enough explanation for the type of gameplay you get in Metro and Stalker. If anything, it would be strange to ask the player to get too deep into things when gameplay is limited to combat. Atomic Heart, on the other hand, presents something new, but doesn't let you play with it. Kingdom Come Deliverance will be a good example of a game that similarly presents something new to most people, check history in their case, but it lets you participate in it, even if you're just a minor character. It's that interaction that makes it engaging. Perhaps I'm expecting too much, because the game is very similar to Bioshock. But I also have a similar problem with Bioshock. It's not really an immersive sim. So what I'm saying is arguably not even about Atomic Heart per se. Ultimately, this is about unrealized potential. If you take Atomic Heart as it is, as a combat game that's inspired by Bioshock, then its gameplay is a fine example of that, and there's nothing inherently wrong with it. So the early parts of the game didn't quite give the best impression to players. It basically comes across as a Bioshock clone, just set in the Soviet Union. You drag your asshole of a main character through linear underground areas while being sexually propositioned by filthy-minded vendor bots. You'd be forgiven for dismissing the game at this stage. And unfortunately it seems that nearly half the players never made it out of those early areas. Which is a real shame, because I think the game changes for the better once you exit this underground bunker and hit the open world. At this stage you can basically roam as you please, and the locations are pretty well put together with a coherent logic. It doesn't feel like you're exploring copy and paste locations. You're still limited by combat being the majority of gameplay, but now you're in the position of being able to choose when and how it happens, whereas in the underground areas, you're more likely to be forced into pre-arranged set pieces. The extra space also makes abilities like dodge and just running away much more useful. So I was better able to avoid getting cornered and killed, most of the time at least. You do have to watch out for rock formations though. For some reason, movement on uneven ground is a bit problematic, but otherwise the open world does allow you to get about pretty well. And you always have the option of getting into one of those dinky Eastern European cars for faster travel. It's surprisingly fun to run over a bunch of bots while listening to some campy Russian music. Even if I was playing on streamer mode, so the selection was limited. But a major part of why I like the open world a bit better is also that the world is better lit. The underground areas do have their charm, but the open world does provide a nice contrast to that. And because you're not constantly using the scanner because you're scared of missing some loot or being jumped by an enemy, you can actually take in some of the environment. The immersion is better. And if you pay attention, you'll see a number of monuments in the distance. When I first saw them during the initial cutscene, I dismissed them as just being there for the cutscenes. But the fact that they actually do exist in the world made the world more interesting. It's a very nice little touch. And it makes the world seem bigger than just the areas you can play in, even if you can't go to most of them. One thing that will catch many people by surprise is that enemies and cameras in the open world will endlessly regenerate. You can shoot a camera, just like in the underground areas, but in the open world, that will trigger an endless wave of repair bots that will just keep coming. There is an option to disable all security in an area for a time, by hacking the main security blimp, but this is a temporary measure only. You can never permanently clear an area. You're only ever buying yourself some time. which, if we're being honest, is more realistic, but it is something that people aren't used to. This will be frustrating when you first hit the outdoor areas, because you won't understand what's happening, and you're just not powerful enough to survive being swarmed. Unless you're deliberately targeting the repair bots, and it's easy to lose track of them in a firefight, there's a good chance you'll have to run for your life. If you look at the achievements, you can see a noticeable drop between those who leave the underground and those who reach the true open world. So I think it's fair to say that the newness of this mechanic played a part. You get used to it after a bit of time, and once you upgrade your gear you'll do fine. But early on it might be frustrating. Stealth just becomes much more important in the open world. Which is ironic, because stealth is not that useful in the underground areas due to the obvious restrictions you have on how you can approach enemies and how quick they are to spot you. But aside from avoiding fights, it's worth sneaking up on enemies because there's a hidden feature that you fully heal after a takedown. And free healing never goes wrong. The open world just gives you more choice in if and how you engage enemies. And this is enhanced by the ability to take over security cameras and scout areas without physically being there. Each area also has an underground bunker called a testing ground that you can explore. It can be tricky to unlock the elevator that will take you down to them, but usually it involves using the cameras and remotely unlocking doors. These locations were, according to the lore, being used for scientific tests like zero gravity and electromagnetism. So as a result, they're mostly focused on physical puzzles and parkouring. Your powers will be used to manipulate the environment in order to open up a path forward. They're very well put together, and some of these puzzles are actually challenging. I found them to be a nice little break from the combat gameplay, and on top of that, fully completing each testing ground will give you 3 weapon upgrade plans. These are important enough that I'd say that you should do the testing grounds to properly enjoy the game. Otherwise you'd miss out on one of the major parts of the game, weapon upgrades. You still need to gather components and materials to apply the upgrades and improve them, but I found that just playing provided more than enough. I upgraded almost every component of every weapon, and I never found myself needing to go out of my way to farm for materials. That kind of grind would have been an easy way to increase playing time statistics, but I'm glad that the devs didn't fall into that trap. The game is well balanced in that aspect, and adding grind would have made the experience worse. But by far the biggest change in my perception of the game was that the game started to show more depth from a narrative and world building perspective. Even the things that were initially eye-rolling began to make more sense towards the end of the game. Why the main character is just so angry becomes clearer as the story develops. He never becomes completely likable, but his behavior does make more sense as you go along. Why the vendor bots are so insanely oversexed.
Why are those dummies in those poses? What were they even doing here and who set them up?
I suspect the machines stood like that on their own.
Perverts.
Look at it from another perspective. These dolls are controlled by Collective, which has most likely gained access to its creator's manner of thinking. This may seem pretentious to you, but to the dolls, it probably meant nothing to them.
Like I said, we ought to be asking their creators about this.
Or rather, the people watching it.
Which makes a lot of sense. Humans are insanely oversexed, and this robotic internet just reflects that. Yeah, it's your fault, so close down that Pornhub tab before you go blind. You start to see some of the things happening behind the scenes of this seemingly perfect world. Of course, the ballet theatre became the center of a high-class prostitution ring.
I'm easy to talk to.
Of course, the robot ballerinas instantly became sex bots. A situation like Westworld is a guaranteed outcome of humanoid robots becoming widespread. It's just the way we are as humans. There's a reason why porn takes up so much of the internet's bandwidth today. The theatre section is where the game's artistic direction and world building started to click for me. That's the point where I started to pay more attention to the lore, and I'm glad I did, because like I said before, many things started to make a lot more sense. It's a bit of a shame that it takes so long into the game before you get most of the information you need for things to make more sense. And it is still just a backdrop to the game and never plays a part in the plot, but it is better that the lore is more cohesive. A particular highlight for me was the dream sequence. From a gameplay perspective, there's precious little for you to do other than collect apples. But from a visual perspective, it's memorable. I spent a lot of time just looking around and taking in the details of this location. The visuals reminded me of some of the areas in the Toussaint DLC for The Witcher 3, and I believe that one of the DLCs delves deeper into this aspect. There's a lot of visual eye candy to be seen in this game. I've made this comparison multiple times so far, but I did that because it just makes so much sense. This game draws heavily from Bioshock. Ultimately, if you like Bioshock's gameplay, then this game will be very familiar. But at the same time, the world it's set in is unfamiliar enough that there will be an adjustment period. In some ways, that combined to encourage players to dismiss the game. It was too familiar when it came to the gameplay, so you start thinking, been there, done that. And it was alien when it came to world building, at least at first. This is a game that takes some time to click, but there is something there to be experienced. I think that one of the biggest reasons why people didn't give this game the time it needs is the devaluing of the world. The main protagonist and the vendor bots were almost deal breakers. I'm not sure exactly why they were added, but the way they are was a major factor in cheapening the game experience. And the wannabe Rambo granny, plus the game systems encouraging you to rush past the environment, didn't help. I can see what the aim was. All of this seems to have been added to create excitement and hook the players. But this may be a case of misreading the audience. Bioshock didn't succeed because it was action-based. It succeeded because it lured players into the world and kept them on their toes with the horror-type elements. That led to players taking it slower and trying to make sense of why Rapture fell into ruin. They were allowed the time to take in the world. I think that Atomic Heart would have also benefited from using the lore to hook players and encouraging slower gameplay. I'm not sure that there's enough in the lore to warrant a sequel or further games in this world, but as a standalone title, it's worth getting to know this game if you like Bioshock style gameplay. I actually played this DLC before I finished the main game, because I thought I'd review it first, but I ended up changing my mind and doing a complete review of the entire game instead. And I'm glad I did, because it allows me to speak about the DLC content with some perspective both from a narrative and a gameplay point of view. The narrative focuses around the rings that you disposed of towards the end of the main game, but now you've discovered that you need them, so it's time to get them back. But you find to your dismay that they're at the bottom of the lake, and because you can't swim that deep, it's time to recruit some dolphins to help you out. The story is a bit perfunctory, but it does change the end of the story to make it more open than it was at the end of the main game. So as you might expect, you'll experience an environment focused on water and underwater based locations that most closely resembles the early Bioshocks. And yes, that includes swimming sections. The DLC extends on what you see at the exhibition hall in the main game. But story aside, the main focus of the DLC is on changing up the gameplay by adding two new powers. The first is a hook ability. That allows you to move faster through the environment and helps during melee combat by bringing you closer to enemies. Essentially better mobility. The second is a fireball that's particularly effective against organic enemies and basically plays like you might expect. Area damage and fire. You lose all your old powers, so no more shield based regeneration, which does change up combat. Instead, you can upgrade your hook to give you invulnerability for a time. Understanding the hook is important because every boss, especially the last boss, assumes you'll be using it often. But there's a couple of shortcomings in the way it works. The first is that you can only hook onto specific points that have been pre-placed in the game. and sometimes it takes a bit of time for the UI to give you the prompt, and then it takes some time for the hook to actually move you. Against normal enemies, you can hook onto them directly, and that's useful for isolating individuals so you can smack them down. But for some reason, this is disabled against bosses. So during boss battles, it's paramount that you prioritize finding those hooking points, even more than actually shooting the boss. You need to get the timing right, and missing a hook because you aimed too far or you activated it too late means that you're going to take damage. This is inadvertently made worse by one of the upgrades that gives you extra speed after a hook. On paper and during normal play it's good, but the problem is that this extra speed animation also stops you from using the hook again until it's over, so you have to deal with this extra delay. The last boss fight ended up being particularly frustrating until I properly understood these things, and made sure to look for hooking points well before I needed them. To go along with the new powers, you also get a new melee weapon that has a whip-like ability as its secondary attack. It affects the whole area in front of you and works great against enemy groups. Zipping about with your hook while whipping enemies is pretty fun in the early parts of the DLC. The shotgun also gets upgraded to give it an energy blast as a secondary attack, so you're combining the features of multiple weapons from the main game into one. That makes it much more useful overall. Another way that combat has been adjusted is that there's a lot more focus on invulnerable enemies that occasionally show a weak point for you to attack. This was in the original game too, but it was reserved for a few enemies only, so it never got too old. But the DLC leans more on that more heavily, and personally I felt that it was overdone. Having weak points do extra damage is good for rewarding skilled players, but that shouldn't come at the cost of just outright nullifying all other damage. That turns those boss battles into a timing game, which is not great. To go along with the underwater theme, a couple of new organic enemy types based on sea creatures have been added. You get your crabs that roll around and swarm you, plus a new crab-based boss. The firewall ability and any area of effect weapon works well against them. Then there's some annoying squids that ambush you and blind you. They go down quickly if you're using the scanner to spot them beforehand, but they can be quite a pain if they catch you unawares. This behavior is unique and an interesting design choice, but again, the scanner feature makes it easy to spot them. But there's also multiple new boss battles that I won't spoil in this video, because it's better to come across them as you play. Suffice to say that they are different from what you see in the main game. Overall, the DLC goes for about 6 hours to get to the final boss, although I had to spend another 3 hours redoing the last fight. So it is pretty short and sweet, and the changes to the weapons and powers give the game a fresh coat of paint. It's for people who liked the combat gameplay of the main game and want more of the same, but with some adjustments for variety.